All right. Again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joel Williams, and I'm a staff writer here at Ballotpedia. Election Day 2019 is 1 week away, and while there are no federal elections on the ballot this year, state and local elections are taking place across the country. These elections have the potential to change the trifecta status of Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia. Joining me today is David Luchs, who's also a staff writer with Ballotpedia. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks, Joel. It's great to be here.
So to set the stage, let's go through the definition of a state government trifecta. A state government trifecta occurs when one party controls both chambers of a state's legislature, usually the state Senate and state House, as well as the governorship. There are currently 22 states with Republican trifectas and 14 with Democratic trifectas, leaving 14 states under divided government where neither party has a trifecta. Why does trifecta control of a state matter?
Well, trifecta control of a state is important because if one party controls all three elements of the trifecta, they have the ability to make policy with far less input from the minority party, as long as they can maintain cohesion among themselves. And this is particularly impactful for this election, since we're coming up on the decennial redistricting process following the 2020 census, when states draw new state legislative and congressional district boundaries.
Interesting. So how common are changes in trifecta status?
There are usually a handful of changes in trifecta status every year. The last year when there weren't any changes to trifecta status at all was 2005. In the past decade, there have been 69 changes in trifecta status across 39 states. Colorado was the state that flipped the most during that time and had 4 changes in trifecta status in that 10-year period. 2018 was a particularly big year for trifecta changes. That year, there were 10 states that had their trifecta status change.
So, as we mentioned earlier, there are 5 states holding elections for one or more of the trifecta components. What's the current status of trifectas in those states?
3 of the 5 already have trifectas. So Republicans are defending trifectas in Kentucky and Mississippi, while Democrats are defending their trifecta in New Jersey. Meanwhile, Louisiana and Virginia don't currently have trifectas, but they could gain them in this year's elections.
Now, before we get into the individual states, I want to briefly touch on trifecta vulnerability. How does Ballotpedia calculate which trifectas could change?
Well, what we do is we look at each individual component of a trifecta that's up for election, and we rate its chances of flipping. So for gubernatorial elections, we use an average of race ratings from 3 separate election tracking agencies. We say that there's a chance of the seat flipping if the overall consensus is that the race just leans towards the current governor's party, as opposed to being safely in that party's hands or likely to remain in that party's hands. And we say that there's a significant chance of a governorship flipping if the agencies think that the race is a toss-up or if they think that it favors the other party. For state legislative races, we look at how many of the seats that are up for election this year would need to flip in order to change control of the chamber. So we say that there is a chance of a chamber flipping if fewer than 15% of the seats up would need to flip in order to change control. And we say that there's a significant chance of flipping if either fewer than 5% of the seats up or less than 5 seats in total would need to flip. And if you're curious to read about our method in more detail, we have a full explanation on site in our article titled Trifecta Vulnerability in the 2019 elections.
Great. So I want to go through each of the states one by one, starting with the states holding gubernatorial elections. But before we do that, what's the overall picture for trifecta control this year?
So Mississippi and Kentucky are the 2 Republican trifectas that are holding elections this year. Democrats could hypothetically gain a trifecta in Mississippi, while in Kentucky that isn't possible since only the governorship is up. Both of those trifectas are moderately vulnerable. New Jersey is the only Democratic trifecta up this year, and only the General Assembly, that is the lower chamber of New Jersey State Legislature, is up. And this means that it is not possible for Republicans to gain a trifecta. This trifecta is not particularly vulnerable due to the size of the Democratic Assembly majority. Then there's Virginia and Louisiana, which are the 2 states without a trifecta that are holding elections. At the moment, they both have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. In Louisiana, Republicans actually won control of the legislature in the primaries, so Democrats can't gain a trifecta. Where in Virginia, the governorship isn't up for election, so Republicans can't gain a trifecta. Both of these states have a moderate chance of remaining under divided government and a moderate chance of a trifecta forming. This would be a Republican trifecta in Louisiana's case and a Democratic trifecta in Virginia's.
That all makes sense. So let's start with Kentucky. It's been a Republican trifecta since 2016, and only the governorship is up, so Democrats can't gain a trifecta. First-term Republican Governor Matt Bevin is up against Democratic State Attorney General Andy Beshear and Libertarian candidate John Hicks. What's going on in that race?
This is looking to be a hard-fought re-election contest for Bevin. He was the first Republican to win a gubernatorial election in Kentucky since 2003. And if he wins, he would become the state's first ever Republican governor to win re-election. And this is because up until 1992, Kentucky governors actually couldn't be re-elected. Two of the three ratings agencies that we track are calling this race a toss-up currently, while the third says that it leans towards Bevin. So there is a significant chance that this seat could flip, and this makes the Republican trifecta in Kentucky moderately vulnerable.
So Kentucky all comes down to that competitive gubernatorial race. Louisiana, which currently has a Democratic governor and Republican legislature, is holding elections for all three trifecta components, but Democrats don't have a chance at gaining a trifecta. Why is that?
Well, Louisiana is unique among the 5 states in how it conducts elections. In Louisiana's primary elections, which were held earlier this month, every candidate for a particular office, be they Democratic, Republican, third party, independent, they all appear on the same ballot. And if one candidate can get over 50% of the vote in the primary, then they win the entire election outright. Whereas if no one reaches 50%, then the top 2 finishers advance to a general election. And that's going to be held on November 16th. So between candidates who won their elections in the primary and races where both the candidates who advanced to the general happen to be from the same party, we actually already have a pretty good idea of what Louisiana's state government will look like post-election. Since every seat in the state legislature was up, it was possible in theory for Democrats to win control of both chambers, and therefore a trifecta. That door has now been closed. In the state Senate primaries, Republicans won 25 of the 39 seats, and in the state House primaries, they won 63 out of the 105 seats. And this means that Republican control of both of those chambers is guaranteed heading into the general election. So it all comes down to the gubernatorial race.
Yeah, that sounds really similar to Kentucky. This is also a race with a first-term governor seeking re-election. Only Louisiana's governor is a Democrat. John Bel Edwards did not win the majority of primary votes necessary to win outright, so he advanced to a general election against Republican businessman Eddie Risponi. How's that race shaping up?
Yeah, there's certainly a parallel to Kentucky in how competitive this race is. If Edwards wins, Louisiana will remain under divided government, while if Risponi wins, he'll restore Louisiana's Republican trifecta. Edwards would be the first Democratic governor of Louisiana to be reelected since Edwin Edwards, no relation, in 1975. Right now, all 3 of the ratings agencies that we track are calling this one a toss-up, so there is a significant chance that this seat could flip. And this means that there's a moderate chance of Republicans gaining a trifecta in Louisiana and a moderate chance of the state remaining under divided government.
And it's also worth mentioning that this is the only race that won't be decided next week. As you mentioned earlier, Louisiana's general election won't take place until November 16th. So rounding off our look at states holding gubernatorial elections, let's look at Mississippi. All 3 trifecta components are on the ballot, and the state has been a Republican trifecta since 2011. Does it look like that could change?
Well, there is a chance that control of the state legislature could flip. Democrats would need to flip 7 of the 52 state Senate seats to gain control of that chamber, and 15 of the 122 state House seats. Those are both just under our 15% threshold. But the trifecta component with the highest chance to flip is the governorship.
And that's an interesting race since, unlike the Kentucky and Louisiana elections, it's for an open seat because incumbent Phil Bryant is term limited. Democratic Attorney General Jim Hood, Republican Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, Constitution Party candidate Bob Hickingbottom, and independent David Singletary are each running. What does that mean for Mississippi's Republican trifecta?
Well, assuming control of the state legislature doesn't change, a Reeves win would preserve the Republican trifecta, while a win for one of the other candidates would return Mississippi to divided government. Now, there's a unique provision at play in Mississippi statewide elections. In order to win a statewide election in Mississippi, a candidate needs to gain not only a majority of the statewide vote, but they also have to carry a majority of each of the individual 122 state House districts. If there isn't one candidate who does both, then the election is actually decided by the state House. There is a challenge against that provision that's currently being held or heard before a federal court, but local media sources say that the case is not likely to be resolved before the election takes place. Right now, all 3 ratings agencies say that the race leans towards Reeves, meaning that there is a chance that the governorship could flip. So overall, Mississippi's Republican trifecta is moderately vulnerable.
So it sounds like all 3 of those gubernatorial elections are competitive. So now let's move on to the two states that aren't holding gubernatorial elections. We'll start with New Jersey, the only Democratic trifecta up this year. Only the General Assembly, that's the lower chamber of the state legislature, is up this year, so Republicans can't gain a trifecta. How vulnerable is the Democratic trifecta looking?
It's hypothetically possible for Republicans to win a majority in the General Assembly because all 80 seats are up, and this would break New Jersey's Democratic trifecta. However, it would require Republicans to flip 14 of the 80 General Assembly seats, and that's nearly 18% of the chamber. So we've rated New Jersey's Democratic trifecta as not vulnerable.
And finally, let's look at Virginia. Since Virginia has a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. Since the governorship isn't up for election, Republicans can't gain a trifecta. Republicans would need to hold at least one legislative chamber to maintain Virginia's divided government, while Democrats would need to win majorities in both to gain a trifecta. How are those legislative races shaping up?
They're shaping up to be quite competitive. In the state Senate, Democrats would need to gain 2 out of the 40 seats up in order to win control. There are 100 seats in the state House, but the margin happens to be the same. Democrats would also need to win 2 seats to flip that chamber. And because fewer than 5 seats in either chamber would need to flip, they do both have a significant chance of flipping. We've rated Virginia as having a moderate chance of a Democratic trifecta forming and a moderate chance of remaining under divided government.
So that about wraps it up for the individual state races. I wanted to take a moment to look at the best case scenario for each party this year. Let's start with the Republicans.
So Republicans' best case scenario involves them holding the Mississippi and Virginia legislatures and the Mississippi and Kentucky governorships, while winning the Louisiana governorship and a majority in the New Jersey General Assembly. This would cause Democrats to lose their trifecta in New Jersey and Republicans to gain a trifecta in Louisiana, bringing us to 13 Democratic trifectas, 14 states under divided government, and 23 Republican trifectas.
So that means Democrats' best case scenario would be the exact opposite. They'd hold the Louisiana governorship and New Jersey General Assembly, while winning the Kentucky and Mississippi governorships and the Virginia and Mississippi legislatures. Where would that leave overall trifecta control?
That would cause Republicans to lose their trifectas in Kentucky and Mississippi and give the Democrats new trifectas in Virginia and Mississippi. And this would bring the overall nationwide totals to 16 Democratic trifectas, 14 states under divided government, and 20 Republican trifectas.
Got it. So before we wrap things up, let's look ahead to 2020. 44 states are holding state legislative elections, and 11 of those states are also holding gubernatorial elections, meaning that all of their trifecta components are at stake. What sort of changes to trifecta status could we see on election day next year?
2020 is going to be a big year for potential trifecta changes. The presidential election also taking place means that there will be more investment in turnout efforts from national groups and more attention on these races than you might see in a typical odd-numbered or midterm election year. It's more than a year out, so there's plenty of time for races to develop and change course, but Ballotpedia has identified 4 states with battleground gubernatorial elections and 17 states with battleground state legislative races. 2020 is likely to result in more changes in trifecta status than 2019. The 2016 elections changed 7 states' trifecta status, and the 2012 election changed 8.
So 1/3 of states across the country have a battleground state legislative chamber next year. What are a few that are worth keeping an eye on?
There are 4 states that really jump out. Those are Maine, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and North Carolina. Across those 4 states, all 8 legislative chambers are battlegrounds. Maine and Minnesota aren't holding gubernatorial elections, but New Hampshire and North Carolina are, and both of their gubernatorial elections are battleground races. All 4 states can also expect to be the focus of get out the vote and advertising efforts from national groups. Each of the 4 has a U.S. Senate battleground race taking place, and all of them were decided by a margin of 5% or less in the 2016 presidential election, meaning that both the Democratic and the Republican nominees are likely to consider them in play.
All right, and so 3 of those states are currently under divided government, and Maine is a Democratic trifecta. So how could these states' trifecta statuses change in 2020?
Yeah, as you say, Maine is a Democratic trifecta, and because Maine Governor Janet Mills isn't up for re-election, Republicans actually can't gain a trifecta in Maine next year, but they can break the Democratic trifecta by winning a majority in one of the legislative chambers. Minnesota currently has a Democratic governor and a split legislature. Democrats have a majority in the House and Republicans in the Senate. And Minnesota is actually currently the only state where the majority party is different between the 2 legislative chambers. The Minnesota State Senate is only up for election in presidential election years, so whichever party is in the minority following the 2020 elections won't be able to gain a trifecta until 2024. Meanwhile, New Hampshire has a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, while North Carolina is the exact opposite. It has a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. Both of those states are electing their governor and their state legislature in 2020, so either party could win a trifecta that year.
Sounds like we're in for a lot more developments in state government over the next year. Thanks for the info, David.
Thanks for having me.
And for more information on the 2019 elections and a look ahead at 2020, be sure to check out the comprehensive coverage available on our website. We invite you to keep in the know with all of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening, everyone.